So, when we talk about the origin of man, or rather we could say the historic origins of man, that which we have written down in clay tablets, in the Bible, in the Babylonian accounts and the Persian accounts, especially when we look at the accounts of the biblical narrative, we're struck by the similarities when it comes to the Godhead. What we have is a monotheistic idea which shows basically a plurality of unity in regard to the attributes of the Lord. For instance, wisdom being an attribute of the Lord was said to have been with the Lord in the beginning, was one of the first creations of the Lord. If we read the book of Proverbs, the book of Proverbs has a lot to say in regard to wisdom. Traditionally, the book of Proverbs being authored by King Solomon. Or we could say perhaps King Solomon wrote a majority of the Proverbs. Perhaps he consolidated a lot of the Proverbs during his kingdom, during his reign in his kingdom, which we know to be around 1000 BCE. Liberal scholars dating it to a little bit later, or I should say earlier. But if we're going to the traditional dating of Solomon, there must have been an oral tradition, like or previous documents. Seeing as how most of our historical records are merely copies of documents that previously existed. In fact, the Book of Genesis being a prime example, as something that seems to most likely have been a compendium which was brought together during the time of right before the Exodus or right after the Exodus, wherein Moses goes to the elders of Israel, stating specifically that the God of their fathers, that is Yud-He Vav-He, or Yahweh, is incorrectly traditionally translated Yahweh, has revealed himself to him and is going to deliver them out of the hands of the Egyptians. It was at this time that the elders of Israel were shown to be a concrete evidence, or what we can say a manifestation of a culture of Israel that pre-existed. That is, a culture that held on to traditions, a culture that held on to the Genesis account, or the genealogical information contained in the Genesis account. And of course, we can say that when we say that the traditional authorship of the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, in which we give it, we attribute the authorship of the first 5 books of the Pentateuch to Moses, wherein in the book of Genesis, really what we see is that he brought it into the other laws that had been revealed to him. That is also in the accounts of the Exodus and then of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. We also see that Moses most likely did not finish the account because those accounts speak of his death. So in all likelihood, Joshua or some of the other elders of the nation of Israel finished the consolidation of the histories. And so when we look at the accounts in regard to the nature of God, we see that while the other gods were worshipped by some of their ancestors of the nation of Israel, that the Lord specifically states at this moment in time that you shall have no other gods before me. And why is that? Because he is a jealous God, going on further, down the line to within the book of Deuteronomy, and it even states that these gods are false gods, and we see these ideas expanded upon and brought forth, that is explaining a monotheism that is much more focused and narrow, and then that the Lord is not only the one Lord, but he is the only one to be worshipped. In other words, many cultures at this time were worshiping various gods and goddesses, but what we see is that in Israel at this time, Moses specifically clarifies, the worship that is due to the one Lord, and that is no other gods are to be worshipped. And what we see here is that in a lot of liberal scholars like to state that, what this proves is that early Jewish or whether Hebraic thought was more of a what they call a henotheistic idea. However, when we look at the account of Noah within the book of Genesis, we come to a passage where it says that the Lord found that Noah was righteous, and that basically it doesn't say why the Lord found that he was righteous. It just says that, out of all the men, on the earth, that Noah was the one, and his family was spared. They were found righteous. Okay, so there's a lot of speculation as to why he was righteous. There is another little sentence in there in the account of Noah which says that Noah walked with God. He walked with the Lord. And his ancestor Enoch was also said to have walked with the Lord. What this really kind of hints at to me, when you look at the ancestral storyline, the theme of Genesis, we see a devotion to the Lord, the God of their fathers, and even later on reiterated the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And we see that in the beginning of Genesis, we start out with the Lord. The Lord is the creator of all. He's the creator of the heavens and the earth. We really don't have any hint of any other gods, except for those passages in Genesis in the beginning where it says, "Let us make man in our image." And then we also see this in the account of when they're thrown out of the garden, that it says, if man were to reach out and grab hold of the fruit from the tree of life, that he would have knowledge, that he would live forever, as one of us. Okay, so there's this plurality that's attributed to the Lord. And how do we account for this? Well, many people, have stated that this is the Lord speaking to the other angels, or some have suggested that this is the Lord speaking to all of His creation. But I think what makes most sense is the concept of the attributes of God as being a plurality of God. In other words, wisdom, as what we say, that wisdom was there with the Lord in the beginning, and that wisdom is personified. We also see that in the very beginning, the Spirit of the Lord hovered over the waters. And so we see not only the Lord, but we see also the Spirit of the Lord. And so there's this a delineation between the Lord and His Spirit. Some would argue no, but if you look at some of the other cultures, and I'm specifically talking about, like let's say Zoroastrianism, specifically they would state that wisdom was an attribute, and that wisdom was to be worshipped. Or like let's say righteousness. Righteousness was personified in Zoroastrianism. And that these attributes were actually seen as, divinities that sprang forth from the one Lord. And so this is really not that far from the Christian conception of, Jesus as being the Word of God. One of the attributes of the Lord is His Word which comes forth from Him, and basically a concept that is worshipped, but this is all within the field of monotheism. So anyway, moving on, when we look at this passage in Noah where it says that the sons of God lain with the daughters of men, the Hebrew terminology is B'nai Elohim. It's a curious passage, and there is a lot of speculation and controversy surrounding it. Recently, I read a little bit about. In other words, most people say, well, these are the fallen angels, or like these are the demons. I read one interpretation lately that said that these were actually the sons of Seth laying with the daughters of Cain. Well, I find that hard to accept because, simply because it states that the terminology, sons of God and daughters of man, and if you look further in that passage, it's not consistent throughout. So what I mean to say by that is, like, when Cain had sons and daughters, Cain had sons and daughters. So what the implication is that the sons of Seth were considered, I guess, more divine, than the sons and daughters of Cain. Actuality, Seth was, just as much of a man as Cain was, aside from the fact that Cain, a mark was put upon him and he was banished from the rest of Adam's line. But moving on, I think what's interesting is that there's a phrase in there called that the mighty men of old, and it says that these were the men of renown, and you could take that in a positive light. Whereas if if these were fallen angels and they did lie with the daughters of man, you would think that the offspring would have a negative connotation toward them and not be like men of renown, So that's a very curious phraseology, and it kind of brings to mind David's mighty men, because King David had mighty men, and he uses that same phrase, mighty men, So it's all very curious, but I think that the one other thing that we need to keep in mind is that phrase, B'nai Elohim, it occurs later on in Deuteronomy, chapter 28, I believe, when the nations were patterned after the sons of God. So what am I getting at here? Well, sons of God, angels, divine beings, basically these were the lesser gods. We could conjecture, we could say that these were the lesser gods, and basically, at that time that Noah, was building the ark, that the earth had reached such a point as to have such a devotion to these lesser beings that God had created, that that they were evoking him so much so that even the women were evoking him down, into their beds. That's conjecture, but this is kind of like along the lines of that, the whole that whole line of teaching. At any rate, we see these stories in Greek mythology about women laying with the gods, and having offspring, like Hercules, a mighty man, men of renown. So, we see those kinds of things, and so, all this sort of comes together when we're thinking about, who were these lesser gods, and I start to think about gods like Mithra and Anahita. These are Persian gods, and the Babylonian gods. And anyway, so the Israelites remain faithful to the one true God. The Hebrew idea, bursts forth, and blossoms in Abraham. Abraham, who, he knew about his father's God, but actually, the Lord appears to Abraham, and says, I'm the God of your fathers, So I find it very interesting, and we see that later on, Zoroaster, and we don't know when he lived, but Zoroaster says that all of those devas, is what a terminology that comes from the Indo-Iranian languages, but from the Vedas, and he says that these devas, which is where we kind of eventually get the word demon. He says that these, they're not the gods to be following. Basically, in so many words, that there's only one God. Where did he get this idea? Where did Zoroaster get that idea? Because up until that point, I guess, it has been suggested, it has been conjectured that these gods were all great. Hey, it's wonderful. Hey, let's go worship Mithra, and let's worship Anahita, and let's, worship the god of fire. Not the god of fire, but Atar, which is like an essence of the god, or his essence or movement or whatever. I can't explain it. But at any rate, what I'm saying is this. Zoroaster comes along and he says, hey, he uses a term that is basically a holy term up to then, and he flips it around. He says, no, all these other lesser gods, they're all lesser gods, they're demons, they're false gods. And basically this is what Moses and what he says. Moses is like saying this, and Genesis from the very beginning is saying this anyway. It's saying it, basically in so many words, through the story of Noah, says that, the sons of God laying with the daughters of men. It seems to have a negative connotation there, and, basically identifying the sons of God as lesser beings, beings that God has created. You could see this in the Psalms when it says, I've said you're gods, but yet you will die, like a man, like a mortal man. Basically showing the mortality of the gods, the weakness of the gods. So, Jesus comes along down the line. He starts saying, I and the Father are one. You see the Father, you see me. But what does it say in the book of John? It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Basically that logos idea, but it pre-existed, that Greek idea. The Greek idea of the logos was pre-existed by the idea of God's wisdom. And we see that laid out in the book of Proverbs. And we see that we see the idea of God's attributes being personified, even in that Zoroastrian Persian, arena. We see righteousness personified, wisdom personified, and they're all, considering that monotheistic. We see that in the Jewish idea, these things being personified. So, I think it's ridiculous that people would say Zoroastrianism influenced Judaism in regard to monotheism, because, like, from what it looks like to me, Persia was pretty much full-blown polytheistic until Zoroaster came along. If you're going to believe it that way, because you can speculate all you want about when Zoroaster lived, and if indeed those lesser gods, like of what we call the Younger Avesta or the Vendidad, the cleanliness laws, and the Yasna, or I should say the Yashts. That the Yashts of those lesser gods, that those are somehow older, like so many thousands of years older, that they somehow pre-existed, Sumerian tablets, when we have no archaeological evidence whatsoever to really lend toward that, except just for the notion that it just seems to make sense. But we could just keep speculating all day long about those things. But anyway, thanks for listening. Sometimes I just need to talk, get things out of my head, listen to it. Probably just sounded like a bunch of nonsense, but anyway, God bless you. Keep seeking truth. Peace be with you all.